Very good morning, everyone. This is George Beiruthi from FS Securities, a stockbroking firm on the Gold Coast in Queensland, Australia. And today I'll show you, like I do that every Monday morning, we go through the previous performance of the markets around the world, and we try to assess what's coming this particular week and beyond. So I'll show you how investors and traders may make money on our stock market. I'll show you what is hot, what is not, what you should hold and what you should fold. So enjoy the presentation, and by the way, if you like the presentation, please give us some feedback. The first thing I'm going to show you is the volume across our market. First of all, you can see the last 5 days there were more advances than declines. As you can see here, more blue than red at the bottom. So we had a very good 5 days, and the market shot up quite a bit, coming to the level that we haven't seen for nearly 10 years. However, we can see also that the volume has been low. So it's not like every mum and dad and every institution that were actually in the market. So that's very important to know, that when the market goes up in price, however the volume goes down, the momentum is not really very strong. So let's keep that in mind. Now we're going to show you what happened over the last 2 weeks across the American market and the commodities on the right hand side. The Dow over the last week went up by 1.21%. However, when you combine last week with the week before, the market was only up by less than 1%. However, the Nasdaq was actually up by 1.6% over the last 2 weeks. Most of it came last week. And the S&P 500 also, most of the rise was actually last week. Over the last 2 weeks was 1.4%. When it comes to the Australian dollar, over the last 2 weeks we were up by 0.7% against the US. However, last week we've seen the Australian dollar dropped by 0.5%. And remember, the Reserve Bank lowered the interest rate, and of course that has an effect on the Australian dollar. Now, when it comes to commodities, we've seen that gold last week dropped by $11.8%, and silver was also down by 2.2% last week. Crude oil was down by 0.8% last week, but still positive over the last 2 weeks. Natural gas was up by 9% over the last 2 weeks. And if you look at the wheat and corn and soybean were all down over the last 2 weeks, despite the discussion between the US and China about who is buying what from who. 3.1% drop in the soy, which really reflect on what China is doing to the American market soy. Now, when it comes to our market, our market gauge, that is the 200, is governed by two main sectors, the financial and the materials. When both of them are up, the market is very strong. When one is up and the other one is not, then obviously it has an effect on the S&P 200, which of course our gauge. Last week we've seen 2% rise in our market. However, over the last 2 weeks we're still very strong with 1.5%. And that is affected by the financials were up and the materials were up. The financial and the materials make up nearly 40% of the S&P 200, that is the ASX 200. Now, looking on the right hand side of what you see at the moment, now looking across all the sectors, actually the top 20 sectors that we focus on because they've got options that we can trade. Now, Newcrest Mines was up by 0.3%, even though it dropped by $11 over the last 2 weeks. AMP up 2.3% over the last 2 weeks, up by 4.8%. As you can see here, over the last 2 weeks, AMP was the best performer, and Woolworths was right behind it with 4% increase. However, Santos had nearly 4% drop over the last 2 weeks. Most of it came out last week. Woodside Petroleum also had a small drop last week, but over the last 2 weeks by 2.5%. Again, we can see that Bramble had 25% drop over the last 2 weeks. That is a major drop for Bramble. One has to look at why that is the case, and we may start to short Bramble. With trading with CFDs and options, we can actually go short. And also Santos and Woodside Petroleum, they're actually because of the oil price going down. Okay, now in terms of our mechanical system, that is the mechanical system that we have devised, we have a different strategy for the investor, the conservative trader, aggressive trader, and very aggressive trader. We treat each of those type of clients differently. Now, across all type of investors, we can still see that the American market is very, very strong, knowing that it actually reached an all-time high last week. Now, in terms of commodities, gold is still high, dropped a little bit last week, but we're still high. Remember, gold closed still above the $1,400 US per ounce. Oil bearish, and we understand why Woodside Petroleum and Santos are down last week. If you trade other commodities, coffee is still very strong. So that may indicate why McDonald's and all the coffee traders are actually having a good price rise when you buy coffee from the various retailers. Okay, the Australian dollar, bullish for the aggressive and very aggressive trader, but for the long term, the conservative trader and the investor, we are neutral. And this is actually what happened over the last 2 weeks. So we give you this in our website, so you can see exactly what's happening to all the trade that we do for you on the overseas market as well as the Australian market. You can see here that the American market after Christmas went up and recovered all the losses that we've seen the 4 weeks before Christmas, and it went down and then recovered, and we're now still all-time high. And this is the weekly on the left hand side, and that is the daily on the right hand side. Now, looking at our market, the All Ordinary, of course, is very bullish. Consumer discretionary bearish, and all the other sectors have been very bullish last week. So there is no point trying to go against the trend except with the consumer discretionary. The difference between consumer discretionary and consumer staple is the thing that you must buy, like the bread and butter and milk. Consumer discretionary, what you buy in TVs and expensive product from Harvey Norman or Domain. So people are actually not spending as much money on TVs and fridges and washing machines, but they still buy the bread and butter because they have to. Okay, now the Australian market, you can see here after Christmas recovered all of it and shot up. Now, of course, there are two stimulus behind the rise in our market. First of all, the interest rate is lower, and we've seen as well that the RBA is actually considering further drop in our interest rate, and the Australian dollar is weak as well. So you can see here the last 4 days we've had a very nice rise in our ASX 200. Now, looking at the sectors and looking at the stocks, ANZ was bearish last week, has been bearish for 2 weeks. If you look at CBA, again, not a strong performance. However, you can see it had a good rise the 4 weeks before. Macquarie Bank, very strong. NAB, amongst the 4 banks, is actually better than CBA and better than ANZ. And when you look at Westpac, so you can consider that NAB is the best company performer amongst the 4 banks. However, Macquarie Bank, which is actually the investing bank, is come good at the expense of the other 3 banks. Telstra had a good 5 weeks, and at $3.86, that is the highest price we've seen Telstra for a long time. Woodside Petroleum, bearish for the aggressive trader, and Santos, bearish for the very aggressive trader as well. BHP has dropped from very strong bull to still bullish, but for the conservative trader has gone neutral. Transurban, bullish, and TPG has gone from neutral to bullish at the back of Telstra's performance. Okay, if you want to get a record of what we showed you here, all you have to do is call us. Now, in terms of companies that have actually performed very, very well, you can see here the ASX 114% increase in the volume. We don't worry too much about that small increase in volume. But in small companies, have a look here for the mid cap. We like to have a look and see what happened to Select Harvests. On the weekly, last week, the volume went up 400%. We want to know why Select Harvests went up by 400% over last week. Perseus, also a company, it's a mining company, went up by nearly 250% over last week. We're going to look into it, and if we think it's actually a good performer, we're going to actually produce a document on it for you to consider. Okay, finally, the disclaimer. We don't know your financial circumstances, so before you trade anything we told you today, talk to us or talk to your professional advisor. We don't know your financial circumstances, again, so be cautious. So if you want to ask any questions, all you have to do is write to us, george@fssecurities.com.au. If you're ringing from overseas, you put 61 first, you take the 0 out, and call my mobile on 411 25 9526. Finally, happy trading and have a good week.